They said nothing could survive the Siberian winter. Not men, not machines, not hope, but steel did. And when that steel came from America, even Stalin, the man who claimed to need no one, couldn't help but admire it. This is the story of how the coldest land on earth was forged by the hottest furnaces in Detroit. How ideology bent under the weight of industry. How for a brief moment the line between enemy and engineer disappeared in the heat of progress. The year was 1930. The Soviet Union was young, hungry, and desperate to prove that socialism could outbuild capitalism. Moscow's factories rattled with slogans, but no machinery. The plans were grand. The furnaces were cold. Steel was more than a material. It was prophecy. It would build bridges, rails, tanks, tractors. It would turn a nation of peasants into an empire of producers. But steel cannot be commanded by speeches. It obeys only temperature and time. And Russia in those days had neither. In America, steel was everywhere. In the ribs of skyscrapers, in the bones of cars, in the lungs of ships that crossed the oceans. The United States was the cathedral of iron. Its smoke was incense, its furnaces altars. Pittsburgh, Bethlehem, Chicago, Detroit. Names that sounded like industrial hymns. To the Soviets, they were the enemy. To physics, they were the answer. And so, in an irony so vast it could only belong to the 20th century, the communist state that preached self-reliance went shopping in the capitalist marketplace. Soviet trade officials traveled quietly to the West. Their briefcases carried contracts, not for weapons, but for ideas. Ford, General Electric, Westinghouse, U.S. Steel, DuPont. The names glimmered like forbidden idols in the files of the Soviet Trade Commission. They offered money, gold, and promises. In exchange, they wanted the blueprints of modernity. Whole factories were sold, disassembled piece by piece, labeled with numbers, crated like organs of a mechanical body waiting to be reassembled. Ships left American ports heavy with the bones of capitalism. They arrived in Soviet harbors to be reborn as socialism. It was a trade of iron and irony. One of those shipments had a destination that sounded more like a punishment than a city. Magnitogorsk, the magnetic mountain. It lay deep in the Ural wilderness, a place where compasses spun in confusion and winters froze the air solid. There was nothing there, no power, no roads, no walls to keep the wind out. But under the snow was ore, enough to feed furnaces for a century. That was enough for Stalin. He pointed at the map and said, "Here, we will build the heart of steel." And so began the most improbable construction project of the 20th century. The first Americans arrived in 1931. They came by ship, by train, and finally by sled. Engineers, welders, draftsmen, and foremen. They expected a sight. They found a void, tents in snow, frost-bitten hands holding blueprints. A mountain of ore surrounded by emptiness. They called it the edge of the world. One wrote home. They gave us a desert and called it a factory. But they built anyway. The Soviets supplied manpower. Thousands of workers, many barely trained. The Americans supplied everything else. Cranes, turbines, bolts, rivets, courage. By day, they shouted over the noise of generators. By night, they drank antifreeze for warmth and drew new designs by candlelight. The only thing more relentless than the cold was their determination. It was a strange union. Detroit's precision meeting Siberia's endurance. English mixed with Russian imperial units with metric, idealism with pragmatism. Every plan had to be translated twice, once linguistically, once politically. American engineers talked about efficiency. Soviet officials talked about ideology. But when the furnaces finally lit it, none of that mattered. Fire has no politics. The first flames in Magnitogorsk were American in origin, but Soviet in spirit. The workers called them imported fire. They burned just the same. The first years were chaos. Tools broke. Machines froze. Workers died by the hundreds. But so did the old world. For the men who survived, Magnitogorsk became a religion, a temple where suffering was sacrifice and steel was salvation. In 1932, the first ingot rolled from the blast furnace, a crude, brittle bar of iron that cracked in the cold before it reached the rail yard. No one cared. They cheered anyway. It was proof that progress could bleed before it walked. The first furnace in Magnitogorsk burned like a wound in the snow. It wasn't efficient. It wasn't elegant. But it was alive. That was enough. In Moscow, Stalin received the report in silence. He read the words twice. First Soviet steel produced. He underlined Soviet. He didn't underline American machinery. He sent back a single sentence. Good, build more. It sounded like approval. It was also a sentence for a nation condemned to labor itself into existence. The Americans stayed longer than planned. They were supposed to teach, advise, and leave. But leaving was impossible. The trains froze, the rivers iced over, the roads turned to mud. So they stayed, building, welding, shouting instructions through interpreters who barely understood them. They cursed the bureaucracy, praised the courage, and learned to drink vodka by the gallon. One wrote home, they have no shoes, but they have spirit. They can't say talk or tolerance, but they can lift anything. The Soviets called them the Americans with fire in their pockets. They respected their skill and feared their questions. When an American engineer pointed out that the concrete formula in sub-zero weather would crack, a party official snapped, "Concrete obeys socialism." It didn't. It shattered by morning. So they fixed it quietly. They learned to do their work in silence, because the only ideology the furnace respected was heat. Progress had to be translated, not just between languages, but between worlds. Blueprints arrived in inches and feet. Soviet rulers measured in centimeters. The conversions filled entire notebooks. A mistake of 1 decimal point could cost a building. When the Americans said weld, the Russians heard melt. When the Soviets said done, the Americans learned to check again. But slowly, painfully, the translations began to align. A rhythm formed: hammer, shout, flame, correction, laughter. Men on both sides realized that while politics lied, physics didn't. They began to trust each other, a forbidden friendship forged in noise and necessity. By 1933, Magnitogorsk had become something unthinkable, a city in motion. 30,000 workers lived in barracks carved from snow and scrap metal. Children went to school beside furnaces. The air was black, the ground red, the sky alive with ash. They built railways, worker dormitories, hospitals, even a movie theater where propaganda films played to men who slept through them. But at night, when the wind was calm, you could hear the low hum of the blast furnaces, a mechanical heartbeat echoing through the Urals. An American engineer named Arthur McKee wrote in his journal, "I can't tell where the machines end and the men begin." That was the point. Stalin wanted not just steel, but a new kind of human being, one molded by repetition, by endurance, by purpose. The dream had a cost. Thousands died from cold, starvation, collapse. Entire villages were relocated, their people repurposed into labor. Magnitogorsk was built faster than it could bury its dead. But the survivors didn't stop. They couldn't. One worker later said, "We didn't build a factory, we built belief." By 1935, production had doubled. By 1938, it had tripled. Every ton of metal that rolled out of the furnaces carried 2 identities stamped with Cyrillic letters but born in English design. The steel didn't care whose idea it was. It obeyed whoever heated it first. When Stalin finally toured the finished complex, he arrived unannounced, surrounded by silence and frost. The workers lined up in gray uniforms, their faces lit by the glow of molten metal behind them. The foreign engineers had already been sent home, their names erased from the plaques. A party official gestured toward the main furnace and said, "Comrade Stalin, this was built by the hands of our people." Stalin nodded. He stepped closer, the heat flushing his face. He placed his gloved hand on the railing. Steel imported from the United States, fabricated by workers who had died before the project was finished. He turned, looked into the orange heart of the furnace and said softly, almost to himself, "It will do." Those 3 words were as close to praise as he ever gave. Within months, the purges began. The same engineers who had built the plant were accused of industrial sabotage. Some were executed, others sent to the very camps that supplied the labor they once commanded. The logic was simple. Success belonged to the party, failure to the individual. Magnitogorsk kept running, indifferent, mechanical, tireless. The furnaces burned on, their roar drowning out the sound of arrests in the night. The machines had learned their lesson. Don't stop, don't think, just produce. And yet inside those same machines, the ghosts of American blueprints still guided every bolt and beam. By the dawn of the 1940s, Magnitogorsk had become what its creators had promised and what its victims had paid for, a miracle built from contradiction, a city forged from ice and iron, a place where death and productivity shared the same address. The Soviet Union had its steel now, millions of tons of it, enough to build bridges, ships, locomotives, and an army of machines that could move an empire. No one mentioned where the furnaces had come from. No one dared whisper the word American. But the steel didn't forget. Every ingot that rolled off the line carried the silent fingerprint of foreign tools and foreign minds. And soon that steel would be tested by fire again, not in the furnace, but in war. June 1941. Hitler broke the pact. The Wehrmacht poured east like liquid metal, unstoppable, disciplined, cruel. Factories burned. Cities fell. Railways twisted into graves of smoke and silence. But deep in the Urals, Magnitogorsk kept breathing. It was too far to bomb, too cold to invade, too stubborn to die. While Moscow panicked and Leningrad starved, the blast furnaces at Magnitogorsk never cooled. They were the lungs of the Soviet Union, feeding steel and breath to a body that refused to stop moving. As the front collapsed, an entire civilization began to move east. Trains groaned under the weight of disassembled factories. Locomotives pulled endless caravans of lathes, presses, and people. Magnitogorsk became Noah's Ark, a sanctuary of industry carrying the DNA of survival. American-built furnaces melted captured German steel. Soviet hands shaped it into new machines. Capitalist rivets held communist tanks together. It was irony turned into armor. Out of that steel came a legend, the T-34 tank. Simple, strong, merciless. Its sloped armor shrugged off shells. Its diesel engine ran on anything that burned. It wasn't the most advanced machine in the war. It was simply the one that refused to die. And inside every plate of armor, inside every track link that bit the snow on the Eastern Front, was the echo of American furnaces. The iron mind from Siberia met the methods born in Detroit, and together they built the weapon that would break Hitler's back. When the Red Army rolled west, it did so on a tide of steel that had once crossed the Atlantic in crates marked Made in USA. During those years, Magnitogorsk worked without pause. The furnaces glowed day and night, painting the sky orange against the endless dark. Workers labored in 12-hour shifts, then 16, then 20. Some slept beside the blast furnaces to save time. Others simply collapsed where they stood. The snow outside was black with soot and frozen tears. But the steel was perfect. A survivor later said, "We lived in hell, but hell is warm." By 1943, Soviet tanks outnumbered German ones 3-1. Factories across the Urals and Siberia had become the arsenal of endurance. Every time a T-34 rolled out, it was as if another American furnace whispered, "Keep going." When Stalin visited Magnitogorsk that winter, he found the furnaces still roaring, their American skeletons hidden beneath layers of Soviet pride. He walked the catwalks above the molten streams, his greatcoat rimmed with frost, his face glowing in the light of the fire he claimed to have built. An aide asked him what he thought of the production reports. He said only steel does not lie, and it didn't. It simply told a truth he could never admit, that even his empire was built on borrowed strength. After 1945, the world divided again. The Iron Curtain fell. Propaganda reamed. The Soviet Union called itself the rival of capitalism, the equal of America. But in the foundations of every Soviet bridge, in the tracks of every locomotive, in the armor of every tank parading through Red Square, traces of American metal still shimmered, tiny fossils of cooperation trapped in iron. The furnaces in Magnitogorsk kept burning, their designs unchanged, their bolts still stamped with American serial numbers, worn smooth by decades of heat. They were relics of an impossible moment when two worlds that could never coexist built one together. Decades later, Soviet metallurgists studying fatigue patterns in wartime steel noticed something strange. The alloy composition in the oldest furnace products didn't match Soviet formulas. It matched Western ones, high manganese, low sulfur, perfectly proportioned. When they traced it back through records, they found nothing. The files had been rewritten, the truth erased. But the steel itself had kept the secret. It remembered what men tried to forget. Steel, after all, does not lie. History likes to talk about victories, about tanks, flags, and heroes. But steel remembers something else, fatigue, the slow bending of progress under its own weight. By the 1950s, Magnitogorsk was no longer a miracle. It was a machine that couldn't stop running. Its furnaces burned the way old habits do, endlessly without wonder. The city had become an empire of rust. The air was so thick with iron dust that children coughed sparks. The river ran red with runoff, but the furnaces still glowed because nothing in the Soviet Union feared death more than stillness. The American engineers were long gone, some retired, some dead, some forgotten. But their designs endured like ghosts that refused to leave. Every decade, the Soviets modernized Magnitogorsk by repainting the same pipes, rewelding the same cracks, and calling endurance innovation. It worked for a time. The steel kept flowing. The propaganda kept boasting. But the men who worked there knew the truth. The plant wasn't an engine anymore. It was a memory that refused to admit it was dying. When the Cold War hardened, Magnitogorsk became more than a factory. It became the spine of the Iron Curtain, the source of metal for submarines, tanks, missiles. But the irony deepened. The missiles built to threaten America were forged in furnaces. America had once shipped across the ocean. The Cold War was a duel fought with the same gun, only the trigger hand had changed. And deep inside those furnaces, the ghosts of Ford engineers and U.S. steel draftsmen kept whispering, "We built this." Generations came and went in the shadow of the blast furnaces. Children born there grew up breathing heat and dust, their lullabies sung by the clang of metal. They didn't know where the machines came from. They only knew they couldn't break them. They called the oldest furnace the American. They didn't mean it politically. They meant it literally. It never stopped working. Even in the 1970s, when newer Soviet-built furnaces failed every winter, the American one kept burning, its steel bones humming in quiet defiance. A worker once said, "We feed it worse coal, worse ore, and it still gives better steel. Maybe it remembers better times." He was half right. In Moscow, bureaucrats talked about technological sovereignty. They spoke proudly of self-reliance, of closing the gap with the West. But their factories told another story, machines designed elsewhere, methods borrowed, chemistry inherited. The engineers at Magnitogorsk knew the hypocrisy, but they had learned to survive by pretending not to. They didn't worship ideology, they worshipped maintenance. In a system built on fear, keeping a furnace alive was a form of rebellion. By the 1980s, the empire that steel had built was cracking. The furnaces still burned, but the men feeding them no longer believed in the fire. You could see it in the metal, a subtle change in quality, a brittleness that mirrored the mood of the nation. The younger workers no longer spoke of revolution or destiny. They spoke of fatigue, of lungs full of iron, of machines older than their fathers. The Soviet Union had once used American steel to build its dream. Now it used the same steel to hold together its decay. The empire that was forged by progress was now held together by rust. When the Soviet Union finally broke apart in 1991, Magnitogorsk didn't explode or collapse. It just kept running, as if unaware that the country it served no longer existed. The party flags were taken down, the portraits of Stalin replaced by clocks that no one trusted. But the furnaces roared on, the workers shrugged. "Steel doesn't care who gives the orders," one said. He was right. The machines that had outlived ideology kept feeding a new one, capitalism again, the circle complete. In the 1990s, Western metallurgists visited Magnitogorsk again, engineers from the same companies that had once shipped it life. They came as consultants this time, hired to modernize what their predecessors had built 60 years before. They walked through the old furnaces and stared at the serial numbers still visible beneath layers of paint and grime. Bethlehem Steel, 1929. Carnegie Works, 1930. U.S. Steel, 1931. The engineers stood in silence. One of them whispered, "Our grandfathers built this. Their grandfathers survived it." And in that moment, the furnace stopped being Soviet or American. It was simply human, a monument to the stubborn, cyclical genius of our species. Today, the blast furnaces of Magnitogorsk still burn. Their glow no longer lights up an empire, but their rhythm hasn't changed. Tourists take photographs beside the relics, posing with rusted cranes that once lifted the world. The guides recite dates and tonnage, but not the story. The story of a partnership denied, of a friendship buried under propaganda, of an exchange that shaped a century. Steel doesn't forget. It holds its history like carbon in its grain, invisible but permanent. Even now, when new beams are poured, you can still see it, a faint echo of the furnaces that crossed an ocean, survived a dictatorship, and outlived a war. The Soviet Union died. America changed. The Cold War ended. But the furnaces, they still breathe. The same fire that once burned for profit, then for ideology, now burns for neither. It burns because motion is its nature, because progress once started refuses to freeze.